I think that because teachers give, like that is the teacher's life, is to be a giver. If one is giving kind of in that one caring capacity, then that's likely going to be something that you engender in other people, which is awesome. Like that to me is, I mean, that's the reason to be a teacher, and the reason to keep doing it is to know that's.
You are listening to the Music and Peacebuilding Podcast, a professional development network at musicpeacebuilding.com, exploring intersections of peacebuilding, culture, sacredness, relationship, community, creativity, and imagination through research and story. Dr. Elizabeth Parker's research focuses on the social development of adolescent choral singers, as well as identities of pre-service and in-service music educators. She has taught within P12 school and community spaces in New York, Nebraska, and Georgia, specializing in the vocal development of young people through general and choral contexts. Within the Boyer College of Music and Dance at Temple University, Dr. Parker instructs undergraduate and graduate students in diverse coursework, including general music, research methods, inclusive vocal development, and sociology of music education. She has published extensively in national and international journals, including the Journal of Research in Music Education, International Journal of Music Education, the Choral Journal, and the Journal of Music Teacher Education. As an active children's choral conductor and clinician, Dr. Parker leads the Troubadours, one of 4 ensembles within the Pennsylvania Girl Choir. I interviewed Dr. Parker because I have long admired her research, for her insights into belonging, identity, caring communities, and choral classrooms, and also for the way she does her research, taking the role of a listener as she empowers diverse voices through intentional listening. I first encountered her research studies when she explored and asked music students about why they do music, essentially asking students about their lived philosophies of music education. Her most recent work has explored lived experience in choral classrooms, examining how singing is embodied, how our shared musical experiences might build our healthy selves, and how we might all become better at building each other up through inclusive community and the empowerment of voice. So if I was to ask you about mattering, I think there's one quote in your study where you say women's choir participants in this inquiry experienced a unique space where they were positively singled out. They felt a sense of mattering to their choir and to one another because they held membership in a group that was perceived as important to the overall choral community. For a practitioner audience, could you talk about this sense of mattering and what stood out to you about it, and maybe what it means to matter in a women's choir?
Yeah, that's a great quote. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
I'm like, wow, that's kind of a nice sentence there. So thank you. But we look at groups as being homogenous, and there is a danger in groups of becoming homogenous and having kind of a dominant narrative that's about that becomes limiting to the members within the groups. I mean, there's definitely that potential for communities to limit the individual voices, but the participants in this study indicated that they, within these groups, that they felt their unique voice contributed to the overall result, and because of that, they felt that their kind of their contribution mattered, and they mattered, and in that they had a more of a place in the overall school environment. Mm-hmm. because they gave in this unique way to this body of girls and young women that then were part of kind of a larger collective voice in the school. And so it's I work with women's choirs now. I work with the Pennsylvania Girl Choir, as you said earlier, and I think about this a lot because I do one of the kind of findings or things that came up for just one of the choirs that was involved in that study was this idea that we still live in a very male-dominated voice kind of society, mm-hmm. and one girl's like, let's face it, we live in a chauvinistic society. That's it, and she was really out there with this idea, like, sexism is rampant, and this is a space where I can not just learn among my peers and feel free to express myself however I'm going to express myself, but that I also feel like we get each other, and they get me and I get them. And then we can move forward in the sense of being important to each other. And then I, maybe as a voice outside of this context, will be more willing to speak up and to kind of use my voice for something in a space that's not as safe. And so for practitioners, to me, that's really an interesting, I think it may be a dilemma in where we are now, because this idea of gender identification is so important that individuals are able to identify themselves where they feel most comfortable. And at the same time, I think that for practitioners, we're really working to create spaces that it kind of, I don't know, foster an empowered voice for women. And so there's a tendency of kind of trying to, figure out that dance, like with especially choral music, with outfits or, attire, or with voicings of choirs, or what do we call ourselves, or how do we negotiate these dilemmas. I think that it can be about empowerment. It can be about upper voices. It doesn't have to be about women's voices, but that we acknowledge that women's voices are critical to work together in some way, and find ways where that doesn't exclude those who may be more in non-binary or may be agender or for whatever reason. So we find spaces to include everybody at the same time as empowering those that still feel, like I said, like we live in a chauvinistic society, and still find space for those conversations to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wondered a lot about that as I was reading about it, about how a name change from maybe like a women's choir to treble choir may change the concept of like really focused discussions on what it means to be a woman, or what it means to be empowered as a woman, and how we retain the best of that while also achieving the best of being open and inclusive. It's a really interesting question, I think.
Yeah, I think choral music practitioners are really working on that actively. And I think maybe some of the strategies or responses I've heard is really finding a name that is not necessarily descriptive of the voice that's involved, but more of the kind of character of the group. So finding what the students really want this group to be about, and then locating with them a label that lifts that up.
I put kind of that work of reclaiming the self side by side. I think what really stood out to me at the end of your study on women's choirs was your relationship back to literature that seems to say, as girls move into adolescence, they seem to adopt whatever the stereotyped identity is, and that maybe a balanced mission of choir on one hand is to develop the most beautiful musical product that's the core of music education, but the other one is to form this counter narrative against the stereotyped identity of women and girls.
Yeah, I think that there's so much that music education can represent for young people, and that space of maybe liberation or openness to difference is a very powerful narrative that we can infuse in music education if we choose to. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, women's choirs were playing kind of second fiddle, I think, to the idea of a mixed or a men's or whatever kind of ensembles they were. And I think that might have been just endemic of the kind of time, but the more that we have worked to publish and kind of hear more marginalized voices, I think more of that music is out there for girls to sing, and can represent possible spaces for that moment, especially that moment in adolescence when a girl can choose to kind of become just part of what she sees, or she can start to say, oh, look at all these possibilities, and stay open to that. That's definitely some of the work also I've chosen to do in the community choir that I'm involved in, is to through repertoire planning to really expand what's kind of what women composers do and what women singers do and what women conductors do, and just to really to demonstrate the possibility so that we have more people entering fields and representing, for future generations as well.
So I'm really interested in a paradox that I think I find in your study of an African-American gospel choir and your 2018 study. And it's this paradox that in so many studies, it seems like a central phenomenon is that choir members sense kind of a sense of oneness or achieving one voice when they sing, which is kind of a loss of self as you merge into the whole. But then the other thing that you find is that once you achieve the sense of oneness, it seems to allow girls, it seems to allow members of an African-American choir to maybe find or reclaim their own individuality and voice. And I think it's such a fascinating paradox that maybe you have to lose the self to gain the self. And I was just wondering if you also kind of noticed this phenomenon and what were the experiences that kind of made this stand out for you?
That's a hard question. That's a good, hard question. I think that's partly why I've been so interested in studying choral music is there's so much uniformity that exists, and there's so much desire to make and sound and be the same. Yet there seems to be so much individually going on that it's not at all, that's not the result, as much as that might look or sound like the result, that's actually not the result. And my challenge has been more like along the study about the choir teachers with community has been really trying to figure out how to address and be with the individual among the group in kind of large ensemble settings. But I mean, there is a paradox. I don't know if it's a paradox as much as I feel like it's maybe like a dialectic, that idea that we kind of hold these things in tension with each other. We hold the self with the group in tension. And then because of that, there's more benefit that comes for both. Like the group is able to grow and the self is able to grow. As long as we don't let one go for the other, I feel like they both can kind of chug along like a train and be in, just like life balance is sometimes in one direction or another. At some point you're giving a bit more, or you're feeling a bit more like you're growing as an individual, whereas another time you feel like you're giving more to the group and experiencing more kind of service, if you will, to a group goal. I think that if you hold them together, just keep them together, that they will mutually kind of work themselves out, but never one really more dominant than the other. It's because I think they are mutually dependent too, right? So the idea that like the selves are growing has to be part of the group growth. If selves are not growing within the group, then the group's not going anywhere. So you have to have, they're almost like nested in a way, maybe nested, or I don't know how to conceptualize the idea.
Yeah.
But to me, the issue is in vocal identities specifically is like, how much are we able to be ourselves in a group and express our voice, metaphorical and musical voice within this collective? Like if you keep having a teacher or somebody tell you like, stop, don't sing like that or whatever, then you're unable to kind of use your, to build your identity. And that's so powerful in the church study that I did.
Yeah.
Is this notion of like having so much oppression and yet like a space where you're valued and you just sing the depth of your soul and your people. I mean, it's just like, it just knocks you flat on your face. It's so strong. And so I think in that case, that particular study, the individual voices are really unrestrained. Like they're in that context, singing context. You're singing to the glory of God. So you are just singing. And that is not mediated by necessarily like the notion of a group sound or like a vowel kind of, it's shift or something. It's like really in the service of something else. And because of that, I feel like there's more alignment between self and group, because it's about something else. It's really about a larger purpose. And whereas a lot of choral music out in institutional settings is about the choral music itself, or about the refinement of that style or whatever. And so I think there's more potential to have that paradox in that setting, an institutional like setting, as opposed to like in a church setting where it's really about, everyone's really clear on what their purpose is. Their purpose is to glorify. And because of that, it's maybe the self does, I guess, take a secondary role, but I think that there's so much alignment between the self and spirituality at that point. It's really, it's not really distinguishable.
In her 2017 study, Parker explored spiritually relevant pedagogy. She states, "One aim of spiritually relevant pedagogy is to engage in collective discourse, to model caring, and to use knowledge to heal the world. Spiritualities may be defined in diverse ways and express themselves in multiple forms. In this study, participants were embraced and accepted for their process of becoming. Educators who teach from a spiritual paradigm also help students investigate life's complexities within the world and their positions within those challenges. Educators encourage students to use their voices to challenge and foster others' voices towards strong self-identity." So if we move back to your study of 4 Midwestern public school choral teachers, and I'm interested in this from peace building because you talk a lot about the development of caring communities. And so I'm really, actually, there's a quote you have in the very end, which you say, "Teachers may then create a space where caring conditions can flourish," and you cite Nell Noddings, "and model an important human kindness that students replicate in and out of music context." Can you talk about where and how do caring conditions flourish within music programs?
There's a few opportunities that teachers have, that music educators specifically have, that not all teachers have, which is that for the most part, music educators work with children and adolescents for more than 2 or so years. Like there's caring relationships that can be built because we have more longevity with a lot of our students. And that opens the door to possibility for caring conditions, because you just have, extended time. But I think it's, as far as creating caring conditions, that's a lot about how a teacher models that idea of being that one caring, and that the student is the cared for. So this, in music, this means constructing a curriculum that reflects the students' voices, I think is one way to create a caring condition, and to pay attention and build awareness of what students value and what they find important. And if we're able to listen and continue building curricula around what the students not just what they want to do, but also what they value, then I think that helps, because that's the content. And a lot of, if people are talking about musical skills and how we build those, I think those are all very important, but those can be done within those caring conditions. So it's about the content that the teacher and the students can construct together. And then to me, those skills just kind of come along, because that's part of what is valued, along with. But a lot of times it's the way, I think, that teachers just respond in the moment to students and their needs. And for example, a study that I'm currently working on some data analysis for, which with Dr. Bridget Sweet from University of Illinois, we're looking at inclusive choirs for students with disabilities. And there's a teacher that we've studied, and she has this way of acknowledging every child in the room in one rehearsal, and it's either through eye contact or nonverbal, like smiling or nodding or something like that. And then, so that's one thing, is kind of acknowledging every being, and that creates this kind of condition that we all acknowledge who's there in the room. But then also she has some basic kind of policies, and one would be that if somebody is talking in the room, everyone pays full attention to that person by turning toward that person, like physically turning and looking at them and hearing all of what they have to say, and then moving on from there. So I started establishing those kinds of what I would consider caring conditions in my own teaching, whether it's collegiate or P to 12 teaching, where when somebody speaks, we all stop and we all turn and we all note that person has spoken, and then somebody might respond or whatever, but that there's nothing else more important going on at that moment, and there cannot be anything. And that has really helped to establish the kind of the caring, the one caring and the caring for, I would say, in that moment. And so there's things like that. I mean, that seems tiny, but it's actually kind of hard to get 43. In my case, I work with 5th through 7th graders. It's kind of hard to get like 43 5th through 7th graders to all stop and turn and look and hear, and then go back to whatever, and then we move on to whatever we're practicing. But it's very significant when it becomes the kind of the ground rule, or the guideline of what we do. And so that's an example, I guess, of creating a caring condition. And then there's just other things too. Like currently I'm working on a book project, and one thing I'm encouraging folks to do is to build in their own students this idea that we take care of each other, meaning that students need to check in with each other during class, not just check in with the teacher, or the teacher checks in with them. Like, that we can build awareness in our own students to look around the room and just kind of acknowledge each other throughout class, and look, kind of take a glance and like see how that person seems to be doing today, and that we should build that. We should educate our own students into doing that with each other during each class period. Like, have you looked at everybody? Have you acknowledged, or have you said hello, or whatever it is, just so we all are aware of who's in the room and what they are, kind of what they're experiencing. Not that we can understand that fully, but to me, those are some of like kind of the basic of caring conditions that make.
And that's in many ways kind of the wisdom of the church choir that you studied. The way that the gentleman or the director stood at the door and greeted people as they came in, and then the way that they seem to have these long, deep relationships with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And the care that they took care. I mean, the idea that someone might, that you just have to make space for people. Sometimes, a child or a singer has to be gone for some, or sometimes they're bringing their like extended, infants and toddlers and whoever to rehearsal. And like, that's cool. Like, we're part of a larger life, and that matters. And I think if you can create space for those things, it definitely makes those flourishing conditions possible.
And one of the barriers that I think that you've named in numerous studies has been this idea of competition maybe as a barrier to either a caring community, or competition as a barrier to identity development. And I was curious if you could kind of explain when competition maybe is okay and a good thing, and then when competition seems to really be a sense of destructiveness within choral environments.
Yeah, I think, I've heard from colleagues after giving presentations like, well, isn't this just the nature of humanity? Like not everybody, there's only so many resources, supply and demand kind of conversation. And while I understand that and I go to this next level, well, if the majority of a social group is moving to a different ensemble, and then there's a few students that don't seem to be displaying the skills that are required, you have the potential to really hurt a child's soul. I think there's really some kind of major damage that can be done by keeping a child. It reminds me in some ways of from what I remember as a child, of like holding a child back into a grade that, they maybe needed to repeat. Like I could see why that was beneficial for that child, but at the same time, socially, that was devastating for this one person I'm thinking about. So it's very tough. It's very tough. For teachers to navigate these things. I'm not suggesting it's an easy decision, but I do think there's some soul work we should think about in addition to skill work. And when we see children moving and kind of being tracked in different ways, that we have to acknowledge that can hurt, and that can be part of kind of how they view themselves and move into a space where they feel less efficacious or less confident to be able to sing or be able to whatever the skill is that we're looking for.
Dr. Parker spoke of the problems of overly selective programs and ability tracking that may start as early as elementary school. She asked if we can ethically develop the creation of labels and identities when voices are so young and developing. How can we build and empower stronger musical identities and capacities?
And so one thing I've been working on is kind of trying to locate and studying programs that are not selective based on audition and see what those programs look like. And that's been an interesting, what I'm working right now with Dr. Marcy Major from Westchester about a non-hierarchical choral program. And what we have found, it seems, is that the teenagers and the adolescents in the program seem to create the hierarchies anyway. So kind of going back to that individual, who said like, supply and demand, like it's the human condition. It's the way it's going to be. I mean, I think that there's so much socialized in us that creates this better than or worse than, or that kind of, it happen. It's going to happen in many programs anyhow, but
you can approach it with intention to push back against it.
Yeah, I think you can. And I think there's a lot of ways. The competition, the things that I've noticed about particularly painful experiences have been things like where an educator says that a child's voice is a certain way, like your voice is to this, or your voice is to that, or your voice is to this. And that is a very personal experience for a child to hear their voice. It's actually like hearing like you're too nice, or you're too mean, or it's a huge qualifier about somebody to say your voice is too big, or your tone doesn't fit in with this group, or something like that. As opposed to making it kind of more about the skill, whatever the skill is. Like, let's work more on building resonance that is, a little bit more focused, or something like that. There's a different kind of conversation that can be had with a child that's exhibiting some challenges. And I think we just need to make it kind of just like you do with behavior with children. You don't tell the kid they're bad. You tell you put it on what their action was. It's similar with singing or any form to me of music making. It's like what the kinds of things we're looking to build are these types of skills. And so we're going to work together on building those. To me, we can still hold the line of whatever that line might be, but we have to make it more about the skill and about the kind of the getting there, as opposed to the child and like what the child brings. Because there's still a lot of messages being sent about you're too flat, you're too this, you're too that, you're too this, and that really does break the spirit of a young person.
I think my next to last question is asking a little bit about a sense of givingness or altruism. And I feel like at the ends of your studies, you start to play with the idea that maybe a goal of or maybe one of many goals of music programs is to craft strong, empowered, and connected identities, and that these identities seem to empower a sense of givingness. Like in the AfricanAmerican choir study, you talk about situating self-stories in a larger web of relations with others that form community. And I think in the most recent study, you say that the finding of envisioning myself may act protectively and help women's choir participants experience greater value in the world, inciting leadership development and potential future service within their communities. So I'm just interested about how you sense that when identities are healthy, they seem to set up conditions for givingness and connectedness. And how did you come to this understanding or realization?
Maybe it's because I really like to see that idea. I mean, I think about it, but your questions are so great. Not only your questions great, but I feel like you have taken the work I've done and like put it into this really lovely picture, which is something I haven't connected, except that I tend to write about these things all the time.
Yeah.
And I should see the themes, but like, I just keep writing about it because I really, again, like another one of my missions is to if the conditions are such that a child builds a strong self identity through expression, which is essentially what we're talking about, right? So they learn that they have something of value to share and they're able to express and kind of work through the who I am questions, then they are able to be with other people, which spurs kind of being with the world. And I mean, it's kind of like it's a little bit like Edith and Victor Turner kind of communitas idea that I brought in that community study. But like, if we are able to to understand ourselves and we do that through relationships with other people, then we're able to really very effectively be with others. And that is what creates collective change, that we're able to kind of join together and envision something for ourselves that is more collective than individual. And so I suppose I see that as a way to maybe ameliorate some of the things that we all experience in our society. Like if we could learn self-expression in a way that brings us to our own personal fullness with others, how could we be separate after that? Like, it's just not possible. And then you take on kind of the bigger questions and the bigger challenges with other people. There's and it's interesting that you asked the question, because one of the questions I had for the adolescents that I'm studying in this book project was, how do you, like, what is your plan for the short-term future and what's your plan for the long term? And they all talked about taking care of either their families, long-term wise, taking care of their families, and then giving back to their communities. Like, that was really a big theme. And they did that through career choices. Like, I want to be, one of the participants wants to be a pediatric oncologist, to work with children with cancer, and somebody else wants to go back and work in the same community music center that gifted the music to him. And I mean, it's just like very powerful to hear what the change that adolescents want to make in the world. And so I think that's a natural outgrowth in some ways of being given to, is that you want to then give back. So yeah, that is something that I feel like is kind of maybe it's just a natural cycle of because everything I seem to see is cyclical. So this idea that, like, that's where we come back around in order to give. Then when we give, we learn more about ourselves and with other people, and it kind of just keeps coming back.
It's a really interesting and very practical takeaway from your work, is that, so as a music teacher, I realize that I can't force a person to take on the disposition of being a giving human being, but yet I do have the capacity to build up identities and social structures that maybe create that environment. So that I feel like that gives me a different sense of agency as a teacher. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, well, the modeling, I think that because teachers give, like that is the teacher's life, is to be a giver. And so by doing so in a way that connects with students, I mean, that's to me a natural outgrowth. If one is giving kind of in that one caring capacity, then that's likely going to be something that you engender in other people, which is awesome. Like that to me is, I mean, that's the reason to be a teacher, and the reason to keep doing it, is to know that that's happening among your students, even if you don't see it now. One thing lately I've been toying with is this notion that in order to be resilient, you really need to understand your own vulnerability, and to fail and to fail well, if you will, to take a failure and to understand that you can then make that actionable and move from there, rather than, I guess, I don't know, giving up or choosing not to do that thing anymore, whatever, but to learn how to fail and to understand that when you fail, it's very vulnerable, and to kind of embrace that aspect of oneself, and to work with children on embracing their own vulnerability, and then kind of getting up from there and moving from there into the next step, and creating kind of action plans with children and with adolescents about their failure. And so I fear sometimes that we've gotten to a place where we don't encourage students to do things they might fail at, because we know they're going to fail. So it's like, well, don't do that, or we keep them from experiencing that in order to protect them. And in some ways, this is kind of a parenting comment as well as a teacher comment. But I think we need to, as educators and as parents, to really be in a mindset where we can, we really need to prepare the students as best we can, but we also prepare them, but we also work with them afterwards, and that we kind of encourage a healthy sense of failure that can build kind of more resilience through that process of vulnerability. And that's one way to create caring conditions, and also to deal with competition, and kind of all the things I've been trying to work through.
Citing Gilligan, Parker writes of the importance of women's choirs in building narratives and counter-narratives of what it means to be a woman. She writes, "Puberty and movement toward adulthood involve a suppression of oneself in favor of stereotypes or a priority on others rather than oneself. Women's choirs represent a counter-narrative, a space where participants could focus on the intersection between competence and connection, and where individuals express that they felt more fully themselves. Rather than experiencing a loss of voice, participation in women's choirs may help young women locate their unique selves and begin to grow in confidence." As I read goodnight stories for rebel girls with my 7-year-old daughter, this is my hope, that she might find musical pathways that build her sense of voice, confidence, mattering, and ultimately, compassionate living. Special thanks is extended to Dr. Elizabeth Parker and the Pennsylvania Girls Choir for the use of recordings in this podcast. This is the Music and Peace Building Podcast, hosted by Kevin Schwerner Johnson. At Elizabethtown College, we host a Master of Music Education with an emphasis in peace building. Thinking deeply, we reclaim space for connection and care. Join us at musicpeacebuilding.com.